Hello, everyone. I'm your sleep sinners for tonight, here to guide you into a peaceful and mysterious slumber. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. Go ahead, get comfortable, relax, and let the rain and stories take you away. Reflections on the Salar, Bolivia. Chapter 1. The Mirror's Edge. The shadows on the Salar. The uni don't behave like normal shadows. That was Mateo's first thought as he watched his reflection twist into something inhuman. One moment he was taking selfies with his friends. The next his reflection's eyes had blackened, its mouth stretching into an impossible grin that he definitely wasn't making. Guys! Mateo's voice cracked as he took a step back from his distorted image on the salt flat's mirror-like surface. Are you seeing this? But Sophia and Luciana were too busy with their phones, capturing the perfect sunset shot across Bolivia's vast white expanse, where heaven and earth seemed to merge into one endless horizon. The Salar de Uyuni was exactly as promised in all the travel blogs. The world's largest salt flat, transformed by a thin layer of rainwater into a perfect mirror stretching 16 kilometers in every direction. What nobody had mentioned was how your reflection might decide to move independently of you. Mateo watched, paralyzed, as his reflection tilted its head at an unnatural angle, studying him with eyes that now reflected nothing but darkness. Then, imperceptibly at first, it began to rise, not as a reflection should, mirroring his movements, but separating from the surface, like something pulling itself up from beneath. Sophia, Luciana, this time he shouted, stumbling backward as his fingers, but not his fingers, breached the surface of the water, sending tiny ripples across the otherwise perfect mirror. Sophia finally looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. What's wrong with you? You're ruining the words died in her throat as she spotted her own reflection doing something her body wasn't. From across the salt flat, their tour guide Eduardo shouted something in Spanish that was carried away by the wind. The sun was setting rapidly now, painting the white landscape in eerie shades of orange and purple. We need to go, Mateo said, grabbing Sophia's arm. Now. But Luciana was still oblivious, squatting near the water's edge, angling her phone for the perfect shot. Just one more minute. The lighting is perfect right now. Luciana, get up. Sophia screamed, but was too late. Luciana's reflection had already risen halfway out of the mirror-like surface. Its arms, longer than human arms should be, reached up and grabbed her wrists. Her scream echoed across the empty expanse as her reflection, with that same distorted face and blackened eyes, pulled itself fully from the water, standing before her like a grotesque twin. The thing that had emerged was Luciana, but wrong. Skin too pale, limbs too long, movements jerky and uncoordinated, as it was still learning how to exist in 3 dimensions. It tilted its head, studying her with eyes that reflected nothing, before lunging forward. Mateo didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed Sophia and ran, splashing the thin layer of water that covered the salt, destroying the mirror effect behind them. He heard Luciana's scream cut short, followed by a wet, tearing sound that he tried desperately to block from his mind. Eduardo was already at their tour jeep, engine running, face pale with terror. Rapido! Rapido! He shouted, waving them forward. As they reached the vehicle, Mateo made the mistake of looking back. What he saw made his blood freeze. Where there had once been just Luciana and her reflection, now 3 figures stood on the salt flat. Luciana's unmoving body on the ground, her doppelganger standing over her, and now both Mateo and Sophia's reflections rising from the water, twisted versions of themselves moving with unnatural speed in their direction. Drive. Sophia screamed as they piled into the jeep. Eduardo floored the accelerator, tires spinning on the slick salt surface before finding purchase. As they sped away from the horror behind them, Mateo caught a final glimpse in the side mirror. 3 distorted figures standing motionless on the white expanse, watching them flee. But the worst part wasn't that they were being pursued. The worst part was what Mateo saw in the Jeep's rear view mirror. His reflection, smiling back at him with that impossible grin, even as his real face was frozen in terror. None of them spoke as Eduardo drove recklessly across the salt flat, the light fading around them. All of them were thinking the same thing. What happens when the sun sets completely, and all that's left of the stars reflected in the endless mirror of the Salar? And what would be watching them from those reflections? This isn't right. Eduardo finally broke the silence as they approached the edge of the salt flat. In 20 years as a guide, I've never seen this. Sophia was sobbing quietly in the back seat, her phone clutched in white-knuckled hands. We need to call for help. Luciana. No service, Mateo said flatly, holding up his own device. Not until we reach Yuni. The tiny town of Yuni was their best hope, the gateway to the salt flats and the only place with reliable communications for kilometers. As they drove, the perfect mirror of the Salar finally gave way to rougher terrain, and Mateo felt himself breathe for the first time in what seemed like hours. We left her, Sophia whispered. We just left her there. Eduardo's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Whatever happened to your friend, that wasn't natural. We couldn't have helped. But Mateo wasn't listening. He was staring at his phone screen, which had gone black after losing signal. In its darkened surface, he could have sworn he saw his reflection smile. Chapter 2, The Hunted. The hostel in Yuni was nearly empty, tourist season having wound down weeks ago. The ancient ceiling fan spun lazily above Mateo's bed, doing little to dispel the cold sweat that covered his body. He hadn't slept in the 36 hours since they fled the salt flats, leaving Luciana behind. Police had been dispatched after the frantic report, but the officers had returned with troubling news. They'd found no body, just footprints leading away from the scene, as if Luciana had simply walked off into the vast whiteness of the Salar. The officers were skeptical of their story about reflections coming to life, exchanging knowing glances that suggested they'd dealt with drug-addled tourists before. Sophia sat cross-legged on the bed opposite his, staring blankly at the wall. She hadn't spoken much since their return, but the constant checking of reflective surfaces told Mateo she was experiencing the same paranoia that gripped him. We need to leave, Mateo finally said, breaking the heavy silence. First bus tomorrow morning. Get out of Bolivia altogether. Sophia's eyes finally focused on him. And go where? Do you think this stops at the border? She held up her compact mirror, angled away from her face. I saw it again this morning. My reflection, it was watching me, not mimicking, watching. A knock at the door made them both jump. Eduardo stood in the hallway, his normally cheerful face drawn with exhaustion and fear. I spoke with my grandmother, he said without preamble, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. She knows the old stories of the Salar. Stories? Mateo leaned forward, desperate for any explanation of what they'd witnessed. Eduardo sat heavily on the room's only chair. The Salar wasn't always a salt flat. According to legend, it was once a great lake filled with spirits. When the lake dried up, the spirits were trapped in the salt. They envy the living who walk above them and seek to take their place. He took a deep breath. My grandmother says they can only cross through reflections. Sophia laughed, a harsh, broken sound. Seriously? That's your explanation? Ancient spirits. You have a better theory for what we saw. Eduardo snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. My grandmother says there are ways to protect ourselves. Saw from the Salar itself, carried in a pouch. and never looking at your reflection after sunset. Mateo was about to respond when his phone chimed with a notification. A text message from an unknown number. With trembling fingers, he opened it. It was a selfie of Luciana, smiling broadly against the backdrop of the salt flats at night, stars reflecting infinitely behind her. The message read, "Found the perfect spot for stargazing. Join me? The reflections are amazing at night." He dropped the phone like it had burned him. Sophia grabbed it, her face draining of color as she read the message. "That's not possible," she whispered. Her phone was in her backpack, and her backpack was with her when she was taken. Mateo finished. Another chime, another message. "I can see your reflections. They miss you." Eduardo crossed himself. "We need to get those salt pouches. Now." As they hurried through the narrow streets of Uni, Mateo couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Every window they passed, every puddle on the ground seemed to hold not their reflections, but darker versions, moving just slightly out of sync. At the market, Eduardo's grandmother waited, a tiny woman with skin weathered like the landscape itself. Without speaking, she handed each of them a small leather pouch filled with coarse salt. "Keep these with you always," she instructed in Spanish, which Eduardo translated. "And cover every mirror, every reflective surface in your room tonight. They're coming for you now that they've tasted your friend." As dusk approached, they hurried back to the hostel, salt pouches clutched tightly. In the growing darkness, Mateo noticed something disturbing. Their shadows seemed to lag slightly behind their movements, as if reluctant to follow. Back in their room, they covered the small bathroom mirror with a towel and closed the shutters on the window. Eduardo insisted on staying with them, sleeping on the floor between their beds. "We leave first thing in the morning," he said firmly. "I know an old brujo, a shaman, in La Paz who might know more about fighting these things." As the night deepened, Mateo lay awake, the salt pouch clutched to his chest. Outside, clouds had covered the moon, and the room was pitch black except for the glow of their phones, which they'd all turned face down. Sophia's whisper cut through the darkness. "Do you hear that?" Mateo strained his ears. At first, he heard nothing beyond Eduardo's light snoring. Then he caught it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like fingernails tapping on glass. Slowly, he turned toward the window. Through a tiny gap in the shutters, he could see a sliver of the street below illuminated by a single street lamp. And standing directly in that pool of light was Luciana, or something wearing Luciana's face. She stood unnaturally still, head tilted back to look directly at their second-floor window. Even from this distance, Mateo could see her eyes, black, empty, and that terrible, too-wide smile. But what turned his blood to ice was that she wasn't alone. Standing beside her were two more figures that, even in the dim light, he recognized as twisted versions of himself and Sophia. Their doppelgangers had found them. "Don't look," he hissed. But Sophia was already at the window, peering through the gap. Her sharp intake of breath told him she'd seen them too. "They followed us," she whispered. "How did they follow us away from the salt flats?" Eduardo was awake now, clutching his salt pouch like a lifeline. "The reflections," he said hoarsely. "They can travel through any reflection. Water glass, mirrors, phone screens." A new sound interrupted him. The distinct chime of a text message. Then another, and another. All three phones lit up simultaneously, casting eerie shadows across the room. Against his better judgment, Mateo reached for his device. The screen showed dozens of incoming messages, all from Luciana's number. But instead of text, each message contained only an image, selfies of Luciana at various locations around Uni, outside their hostel, in the market where they'd gotten the salt pouches, standing in the hallway outside their room. The final image made Mateo cry out. Luciana, standing in what was clearly their bathroom, reflected in the covered mirror. The tap-tap-tapping at the window grew louder, more insistent. And now there was a new sound, a similar tapping, but closer, coming from the bathroom. "They can't come in," Eduardo said, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. "The salt protects us." As if an answer, something heavy slammed against the bathroom door, making them all jump. The tapping at the window had become a pounding. "The towel," Sophia gasped. "If the mirror in the bathroom isn't completely covered." Another slam against the bathroom door, harder this time. The cheap wood began to splinter. Eduardo was on his feet, pulling them toward the exit. "We need to run. Now!" They burst into the hallway, just as the bathroom door gave way. Mateo caught a glimpse of something pale and twisted squeezing through, its movements jerky and wrong, before Eduardo slammed their door shut. The hallway was dark except for the green exit sign at the far end. They ran toward it, their footsteps echoing loudly on the tile floor. "Where are we going?" Sophia gasped as they tumbled down the stairs. "Anywhere without reflections," Eduardo answered, leading them through the empty lobby and out into the street. Outside, the night was moonless and cold. The street lamp where they'd seen the doppelgangers was now dark, the bulb apparently shattered. They ran blindly through quiet town, every puddle and darkened window a potential portal for their pursuers. Mateo's phone continued to chime with incoming messages, but he didn't dare look at the screen. He could feel the weight of his reflections gaze through the darkened device in his pocket. "The church," Eduardo panted, pointing toward the silhouette of a bell tower against the night sky. "Holy ground. Maybe it will help." The ancient church door was unlocked, swinging open with a groan that echoed in the empty nave. Inside, the only light came from a few flickering candles near the altar. They collapsed into a pew, gasping for breath. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing and the softest of candle flames. "What do they want?" Sophia finally asked, her voice small in the vastness of church. Eduardo's answer was grim. "To replace you, to take your life, your identity, to walk in the world of the living." "Why us?" Mateo demanded. "Why now?" "The conditions must have been perfect," Eduardo said. "The water level on the Salar, the angle of the sun, and they need people who are receptive." "Receptive to what?" "To replacement. People disconnected from themselves, always seeing their own reflection, always performing for an audience that isn't there." Eduardo nodded toward their phones. "Always living half in the real world, half in a reflection of it." Mateo thought about how they'd spent their time on the salt flats, not experiencing the wonder directly, but through the screens of their phones, obsessed with capturing the perfect image of themselves against a spectacular backdrop. A sudden gust of wind rattled the church's stained glass windows, sending shadows dancing across the walls. One of the candles near the altar went out. Then another. "They found us," Sophia whispered. Mateo clutched his salt pouch tighter, scanning the shadows. The darkness between the pews seemed to move, flowing like water toward them. Another candle went out, and another. Eduardo was on his feet, pulling them toward the altar. "The salt," he hissed. "Form a circle with it." As the last candles flickered, they frantically poured their pouches of salt into a rough circle on the stone floor, stepping inside just as darkness engulfed the church. In the total blackness, Mateo could hear something moving. No, multiple somethings, sliding across the stone floor, circling their protective boundary. "Whatever happens," Eduardo whispered, "don't break the circle, and don't look directly at them." As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Mateo began to make out shapes moving just beyond the salt line. Humanoid but wrong, their proportions distorted, movements jittery like frames missing from a video. One of them stepped closer to the circle, into a thin shaft of starlight coming through a high window. Mateo had to bite his fist to keep from screaming. It was his doppelganger. From the dim light, he could now see exactly how wrong it was. Its skin had the same glistening quality as the salt flats, reflecting the minimal light in unnatural ways. Its joints bent at impossible angles, and its face, what should have been his face, was stretched into that terrible grin that revealed too many teeth. It studied him with black eyes that reflected nothing, then spoke with a voice that was but distorted, as if heard underwater. Let us in. Chapter 3. The Breaking. Dawn filtered through the church's stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor where Mateo, Sophia, and Eduardo huddled within their protective circle of salt. They had survived the night, though none of them had slept. Their reflections had retreated with the coming light, melting into shadows like ice under the sun. But Mateo knew they were still watching, waiting. "We can't stay here forever," Sophia said, her voice hoarse. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she hugged her knees to her chest. Eduardo nodded grimly. "The bus to La Paz leaves in 2 hours. If we can make it there, my contact might know how to end this." Mateo stared at the remnants of their salt circle, now broken in places where they'd shifted during the long night. "How are we supposed to get to the bus without passing any reflective surfaces? The whole town will be waking up. There will be windows, car mirrors, puddles from last night's rain." "We still have some salt," Eduardo said, dividing what remained among them. "Keep it in your hand at all times. Don't look at any reflections. Walk fast, but don't run. Running attracts attention." They stepped cautiously out of the church into the early morning light. Uni was waking up, shopkeepers raising their shutters, a few early tourists with backpacks heading toward the salt flat tour offices. Every reflective surface they passed felt like a threat. Mateo kept his eyes fixed on the ground, but couldn't help noticing how each puddle they approached seemed to darken momentarily, as if something below the surface was shifting. They were halfway to the bus station when Sophia gasped, stopping abruptly. "My passport," she whispered. "It's still at the hostel." Eduardo cursed under his breath. "We don't have time to go back." "I needed to cross the border," she insisted, her voice rising with panic. "We can't just—" "Keep your voice down," Mateo hissed, noticing how a nearby shopkeeper's window seemed to ripple as Sophia's voice carried across the street. Eduardo looked at his watch. "The bus leaves in 90 minutes. If we hurry—" A familiar chime interrupted him. Mateo's phone. Without thinking, he pulled it from his pocket, then immediately regretted it as the black screen reflected his face back at him, except it wasn't quite his face. The reflection smiled. The screen lit up with a new message from Luciana's number. "Coming home with you." "We need to move," Mateo said, shoving the phone back into his pocket. "Now." They changed direction, hurrying back toward the hostel. Every step felt wrong to Mateo, like they were being herded exactly where the reflections wanted them to go. The hostel lobby was empty except for a sleepy receptionist who barely looked up as they rushed past. Their room door stood ajar, the splintered bathroom door visible beyond. "I'll keep watch," Eduardo said, positioning himself in the hallway as Sophia darted into the room to retrieve her passport. Mateo followed her in, careful to keep his eyes away from the bathroom and its uncovered mirror. The room was exactly as they'd left it in their panicked escape. Beds unmade, Sophia's backpack still on the floor. As she rummaged through it, Mateo noticed something odd. There was water on the floor, a thin film spreading outward from the bathroom doorway. "Sophia," he said quietly, "we need to leave right now." But Sophia wasn't listening. She'd found her passport and was now staring at something on her bed. Her compact mirror, open, placed deliberately in the center of the pillow. "I put this in my bag," she whispered. "I know I did." Before Mateo could stop her, She looked into the small mirror surface. Her scream pierced the quiet morning. The compact dropped from her hand as she stumbled backward, clutching at her face. "It's not me," she shrieked. "The reflection, it's not me." Eduardo rushed into the room. "What happened?" Mateo pointed at the compact on the bed. She looked. The words died in his throat as he saw what was happening to Sophia. Her skin seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. She clawed at her face, her screams giving way to a horrible choking sound. The salt. Eduardo, but it was too late. Sophia's body convulsed violently, her back arching at an impossible angle. When she straightened again, she moved differently, jerky, mechanical, and when she turned to face them, her eyes were black pools, her mouth stretched in that now familiar, terrible grin. It wasn't Sophia anymore. No! Mateo lunged forward, but Eduardo held him back. "That's not her," he hissed. "That's what they do. They switch places." The thing that had been Sophia tilted its head, studying them with those empty eyes. When it spoke, the voice was Sophia's but wrong, like hearing her speak underwater. "More coming," it said, the words strangely accented, all coming through. Eduardo pulled Mateo toward the door, but the Sophia thing moved with unnatural speed, blocking their exit. Behind it, Mateo could see the water from the bathroom spreading faster now, flowing upward in defiance of gravity, coating the walls and ceiling with a mirror-like sheen. "The window!" Eduardo gasped, dragging Mateo toward it. They crashed through the shutters onto the narrow balcony outside. Below them was a drop of about 4 meters to the street. "Jump!" Eduardo commanded, already swinging his legs over the railing. The thing that wasn't Sophia lunged at them, its movements fluid yet wrong, like watching a video played at slightly the wrong speed. Its fingers, longer now, joints bending backward, grasped at Mateo's shirt as he scrambled over the railing. He fell hard, pain shooting through his ankle as he hit the ground. Eduardo landed beside him with a grunt. Above them, the Sophia thing leaned over the balcony, that terrible smile widening impossibly as it watched them. Then, to Mateo's horror, it began to climb over the railing, moving with the liquid grace of something not constrained by human physiology. "Run!" Eduardo gasped, pulling Mateo to his feet. They limped away as fast as Mateo's injured ankle would allow, not looking back even as they heard the soft thud of the creature landing on the street behind them. The bus station was 3 blocks away. Every window they passed seemed to ripple as they hurried by. Mateo could have sworn he saw faces in them. His face, Sophia's, Luciana's, watching with black eyes and twisted smiles. Almost there, Eduardo panted as the bus station came into view. A handful of tourists and locals milled about the small terminal, waiting for the morning buses. The La Paz bus idled nearby, engine running, a few passengers already boarding. They were 20 meters from the station when Mateo's phone chimed again. Despite everything, he found himself pulling out, some part of him still hoping this was all an elaborate nightmare, that the screen would show a normal message from the real Luciana saying this had all been a sick prank. Instead, the screen showed a video playing, footage of the salt flats at night, stars reflected infinitely in the perfect mirror. The camera panned down to show dozens of figures emerging from the reflective surface, each one distorted in that now familiar way, moving with that same wrong fluidity. An army of reflections coming through. "They're not just after us," Mateo whispered, showing Eduardo the video. "They're coming for everyone." Eduardo's face paled. "The bus. We need to warn people." As they reached the station, Mateo grabbed the arm of a young woman about to board the La Paz bus. "Don't go to the salt flats," he urged. "It's not safe." The woman pulled away, giving him a disgusted look. "Let go of me, creep." "Please," Mateo begged, looking around at the other tourists. Listen to me. The reflections in the Salar, they come alive at sunset. They take you, replace you. It happened to our friend. A security guard approached, hand on his radio. Is there a problem here? Eduardo stepped forward. Please, sir, we're trying to warn people. There's danger at the salt flats. The guard's expression softened slightly. Ah, the missing tourist girl? We found her this morning, heading back to town. She said she got separated from your group and spent the night with another tourer. Mateo felt his blood freeze. You found Luciana? The guard nodded. See, about an hour ago. Pretty girl, long dark hair. She was with a couple of friends. Looked just like you, too. Actually, said they were heading to La Paz to file a report about a guide who abandoned them. He gave Eduardo a pointed look. Eduardo grabbed Mateo's arm, his grip painfully tight. We need to leave. Now. But the damage was done. As they backed away from the guard, Mateo caught sight of movement at the far end of the station. 3 figures had just entered, moving with that distinctive wrong fluidity. Luciana, Sophia, and his own doppelganger. They were trapped. This way, Eduardo hissed, pulling him toward the back of the station where maintenance vehicles were parked. They ducked behind a truck as their pursuers scanned the station. Mateo could see the guard pointing in their direction, confusion evident on his face as he spoke to Thing, wearing Luciana's face. What do we do? Mateo whispered, clutching the last of his salt in his sweating palm. Eduardo's expression was grim. They're cutting off our escape. They want to herd us back to the Salar. He pointed to a small maintenance vehicle with keys in the ignition. That's our only chance. You want to steal a truck? You want to be replaced by that thing? Eduardo countered, nodding toward Mateo's doppelganger, which was now methodically moving through the station, checking under benches and behind counters. They made their move when the creatures were looking the other way, rushing to the maintenance truck. Eduardo slid behind the wheel, while Mateo limped around to the passenger side. As Eduardo turned the key, the engine roared to life, and 3 heads snapped in their direction with perfect synchronization. The creatures moved toward them with that terrible, unnatural speed. Eduardo floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward just as Mateo's doppelganger reached for the door handle. Its black eyes locked with us for a moment, that terrible smile widening before they sped away. Where are we going? Mateo asked as they left Uni behind, driving not toward La Paz but back in the direction of the salt flats. To end this, Eduardo said grimly, my grandmother told me there's a way. The reflections can be trapped again, but only at the point where they first crossed over. You want to go back to the salt flats? That's suicide. Eduardo's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. If what we saw in that video is real, these things are coming through by the dozens, maybe hundreds. They won't stop with just the 3 of us. As they drove, Mateo's phone chimed continuously with new messages. Video after video showing more reflections emerging from the Salar surface, spreading out across the vast white expanse. How do we stop them? Mateo asked, his voice hollow. Eduardo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a dark liquid. My grandmother gave me this before we left. She said if all else failed. What is it? Blood. Eduardo said simply. Hers. An offering to the spirits of the lake. Blood freely given to replace blood taken by force. Mateo stared at the vial. And that will stop them? Maybe, if we can make it to where your friend was taken and pour it at sunset, the same time they first came through. The salt flats loomed ahead, blindingly white under the midday sun. As they approached, Mateo could see dark shapes moving across the surface, dozens of them, all with that same wrong fluidity to their movements. There's too many, he whispered. Eduardo parked the truck at the edge of the Salar. We wait until sunset. That's when the barrier between their world and ours is thinnest. He handed Matteo the vial. If something happens to me, you need to pour this exactly where your friend was taken. Hours passed as they watched the doppelgangers moving across the salt flat, their numbers growing as the sun sank lower. They seemed to be gathering, forming concentric circles around the spot where Luciana had been taken. Just before sunset, Eduardo spotted movement on the road behind them. A bus approaching, loaded with tourists for the sunset tour of the Salar. "No," he breathed. "We have to stop them." But it was too late. The bus had already pulled up to the edge of the salt flat, and excited tourists were pouring out, cameras ready to capture the famous sunset reflection. "We have to warn them," Matteo said, reaching for door handle. Eduardo grabbed his arm. "There's no time. Look." The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the white landscape in shades of orange and gold. And as the light changed, so did the reflections on the Salar surface. Every tourist who stepped onto the salt flat created a reflection, and every reflection began to twist, to distort, to move independently of its owner. Screams erupted as people noticed what was happening. Some ran, but others stood frozen in horror as their reflections began to rise from the water's surface. "Now," Eduardo said, pulling Matteo from the truck. "We have to do it now." They ran onto the salt flat, splashing through the thin layer of water. Around them, chaos erupted as reflections emerged, grabbing at their human counterparts. The tour guide was shouting, trying to herd people back to the bus, but many were already beyond help. Matteo spotted the exact location where Luciana had been taken, a slightly darker patch on the white salt, still visible in the fading light. He pulled the vial from his pocket, ready to pour the offering. A familiar voice called his name. He turned to see Sophia and Luciana approaching, but not the things that had taken their forms. These were different, their movements natural, their eyes normal, their expressions frightened rather than twisted. "Matteo," Sophia called again. "Help us." He hesitated, vial in hand. "Sophia?" Eduardo grabbed his arm. "It's a trick. Pour the blood." But Matteo couldn't move. The figures coming toward them looked exactly like his friends. Not the distorted versions that had chased them, but Sophia and Luciana as he remembered them. "They trapped us on the other side," Luciana called, her voice breaking. "Please help us get back." Matteo took a step toward them. Eduardo tried to hold him back, but Matteo shook him off. What if it's really them? What if their reflections trapped them over there? "Matteo," Eduardo warned. "The sun is setting. We have seconds." The last rays of sunlight glinted off the water's surface. Around them, more reflections were emerging, moving toward the terrified tourists. Screams filled the air. Matteo looked from a vial in his hand to his friend's approaching figures, torn by indecision. They were close enough now that he could see tears on Sophia's cheeks, fear in Luciana's eyes. "Please," Sophia begged, reaching out her hand. "We're running out of time." Matteo made his choice. He stepped forward, extending his hand to Sophia. Their fingers touched, and Sophia's face transformed, splitting into that terrible grin. Her eyes blackened, and her grip on his hand became iron. "Fool," she hissed in that underwater voice, yanking him toward her. Matteo stumbled forward, directly onto the dark patch where Luciana had been taken. As he fell, his hand clutched the vial, crushing it. Blood, Eduardo's grandmother's willing sacrifice, spilled onto the salt, mixing with the shallow water. The effect was immediate. The surface of the Salar began to ripple violently, concentric circles spreading outward from where the blood had spilled. The thing gripping Matteo's hand screamed, a sound like ice cracking, and released him, all across the salt flat. The emergent reflections contorted in agony, their distorted bodies beginning to dissolve back into the water's surface. The Sophia thing thrashed as it was pulled downward, its black eyes fixed on Matteo with pure hatred. "Matteo!" Eduardo shouted, pulling him backward as the salt beneath his feet began to sink. They stumbled away as a whirlpool formed where the blood had been spilled, growing larger by the second. Reflections from all across the Salar were being dragged toward it, their impossible bodies flowing like mercury back into the vortex. Tourists ran screaming toward the buses, many dragging friends or family who'd been attacked by their reflections but not yet fully replaced. Matteo and Eduardo backed away as the vortex grew, swallowing every twisted reflection in its path. The last to go was Matteo's own doppelganger, which stood at the edge of the whirlpool, that terrible smile still fixed on its face. "This isn't over," it said in Matteo's voice, distorted and wrong. "Reflections are everywhere." Then it too was gone, sucked down into the depths of the Salar. As suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ended. The water's surface stilled, once again perfectly reflecting the darkening sky above. No trace remained of the horror they had witnessed, except for the terrified tourists huddled at the edge of the salt flat. "Is it over?" Matteo asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eduardo looked out across the now peaceful Salar. "For now, the offering worked, but my grandmother warned me it might not last forever." In the distance, emergency vehicles approached, their lights flashing across the white landscape. Someone had called for help, though Matteo couldn't imagine how they would explain what had happened here. As night fell completely, the stars emerged, reflecting perfectly in the thin layer of water covering the salt. To anyone who hadn't witnessed the horror, it would look breathtakingly beautiful. Heaven and earth merged into one infinite mirror. But Matteo knew the truth now, and as he stared at his own reflection in the starlit water, he could have sworn he saw it smile. 3 months later, Matteo sat in a cafe in La Paz, nursing a cup of coffee as he waited for Eduardo. After the incident at the Salar, officially recorded as a mass hallucination caused by unusual atmospheric conditions, they had stayed in touch, monitoring reports from Uni for any signs that the reflections might be returning. His phone buzzed with a notification. A news alert. Tourist missing at Salar de Uyuni. 3rd disappearance this month. Matteo's blood ran cold. He opened the article to find a familiar pattern. Tourists venturing onto the salt flats at sunset, never returning. Witnesses described seeing the missing people walking off into the Salar as if following someone, though they appeared to be alone. Eduardo arrived, sitting heavily across from him. One look at Matteo's face told him everything. "It's happening again, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Matteo nodded, sliding his phone across the table. "The blood offering. Your grandmother said it might not last forever. She said it would buy us time," Eduardo corrected. "Time to find a permanent solution." Matteo stared into his coffee, the dark surface reflecting his face back at him. He no longer trusted reflections. Not in mirrors, not in windows, not in the black screens of phones or the surfaces of still water. He had covered every reflective surface in his apartment, avoided puddles after rain, kept his phone screen shattered rather than replacing it. But he knew he couldn't hide forever. None of them could. "So what's the permanent solution?" he finally asked. Eduardo leaned forward, lowering his voice. "My contact, the Brujo I told you about. He found something, an old ritual from before the Spanish came. It requires returning to the Salar at the dark of the moon. You want to go back?" "We have to. The reflections are getting stronger, finding new ways through. That tourist bus we saved, half of those people have reported seeing their reflections acting independently since that night. It's spreading." Matteo thought of Sophia and Luciana, or rather, the things wearing their faces. After the chaos at the Salar, the authorities had never found them. They were out there somewhere, perfectly disguised as his friends, perhaps sharing their story on social media, drawing more curious tourists to the Salar. What about the others? Mateo asked. The ones that got through before we closed the portal? Eduardo's expression was grim. That's why we need to go back. The ritual will not only seal the passage between worlds, but it will reveal the imposters who've already crossed over, force them back to their own reality. Mateo's phone screen lit up with another notification, a text message from Sophia's number. Missing you. Come back to the Salar. The reflections are amazing at sunset. He showed it to Eduardo, who nodded grimly. They're getting desperate. They know we're planning something. Mateo stared out the cafe window, where the light rain had created puddles along the street. In one, he caught a glimpse of his reflection, and for just a moment, he could have sworn it moved independently, raising a finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. When do we leave? He asked, turning away from the window. Tonight, Eduardo said, sliding a bus ticket across the table. Dark of the moon is tomorrow. One last chance to end this for good. As they left the cafe, Mateo carefully avoided looking down at the puddles, but he could feel them watching him, all the reflections, in every drop of water, every window, every darkened screen, waiting to pull him through to the other side, waiting to take his place in the world of the living. And as night fell over La Paz, every reflective surface in the city seemed to darken, as if something was moving beneath them all, connected by an invisible network of mirrors and shadows. The battle for the Salar, and perhaps for the world itself, was far from over. It had only just begun. The end.